It's Beau. It is January 5th, and yesterday I finished my first book in January, which means that it is time for another vlog-style reading wrap-up. We are doing our January 2022 monthly reading wrap-up. I'm talking about the books in order that I read them. The first book that I finished in January was The Ice Storm by Rick Moody. I actually read the majority of this, all but about 115 pages in 2020, and then I DNF'd it. I DNF'd it because it is quite a heavy, depressing story, but I had always intended to come back to it, so in the very beginning of 2022, I picked it back up and read the remaining 115 pages. This book is about two upper middle class white families in an affluent neighborhood in Connecticut in the 1970s. Our main characters are the Hoods, and they are all kind of coming of age in their own way. Elena, the mother and wife, is kind of realizing that she doesn't really know what her identity is, and that she went from high school to college to having kids, and she doesn't know what kind of potential as a person she has. Her son, Paul, is awkward and still into comic books even though he's at college. Their daughter, Wendy, is becoming very politically active, but she doesn't really understand where to put all of her anger and rage over the political climate of the day. She's also coming of age sexually and kind of teasing the two neighbor boys, experimenting with them and getting into some trouble there. And then Benjamin Hood, the patriarch of the family, is struggling with his job. He doesn't really like himself. He's older, fat, and unfit, and he's having an affair with the neighbor, Janie Williams. Janie and her husband have the two young boys. They are the other main players in this story, although really the story mostly follows the Hoods. This story takes place all over one sad Thanksgiving weekend. We have the family members kind of going in different directions and carrying on in their own isolated and insular depression and discovery, trying to express emotions and feelings that they have without ever having been taught the tools to express those things. This is a writing style of book that I enjoy, where every emotion is also a metaphor, where every action is also an emotion, where every incident is also a description of an object, where every object is a feeling. I liked that writing, especially when I first started reading it. I do love coming of age stories, and I love kind of depressing stories as well, but this was an extremely depressing story in that all of these characters have been rent apart just by the isolation of their own lives and how they've taught each other to be isolated from each other. It's very much a unsatisfying relationship in every respect for every person. Benjamin and Elena don't communicate well and don't get along and are headed for divorce. Benjamin and Janie Williams, his mistress, are separating as well, and he thinks he's in love with her. Paul is an awkward young adult and wants to hook up with a girl but can't. Wendy thinks she has a handle on what's going on, but she does not. It's very much of a downer. Every character is unhappy. Every character will continue to be unhappy, and the events in this book are only going to make them more unhappy and expand the rifts that have already been created. I love the movie of this book by Ang Lee, and that was primarily why I wanted to pick it up. That's not an uplifting movie. It's not a not depressing movie. It's very depressing, but there's something very beautiful and visually stunning about that film, and there is some hope in that film. There's no hope in this book. There's nothing that these characters are going to do in this book that is not going to be selfish and unsettling and ultimately isolating. I also think that now that I have a whole year of 2021 of reading more diversely under my belt, reading about upper middle class white people is like not that interesting to me anymore. That might have been something that I was really interested in at one point, especially that coming of age, different gender identities of white people and white families, but I'm not, I don't know, it falls a little flat these days. I did enjoy this book and I'm happy to have finished it, but I'm like, happy to have finished it. And that was the first book that I read in January. It is January 10th, and I have finished 2 more books in January. I finished Lore Olympus, which is a Hades and Persephone love story retelling, and this is by Rachel White. This is a webcomic that has been made into a book, and it is a graphic novel. I read all of the Heartstopper volumes last year via Webtoons, via webcomic, and I really like the idea of reading a webcomic, one, because it reminds me of when I used to read webcomics as a youngster, and also I just think it's a really interesting medium, so I think it's an interesting idea to have a webcomic. I also like the idea that it could be a book, so that if you really love it, then you can get the graphic novel as well. The first volume of Lore Olympus is really short. I did like it, and I do look forward to reading the second volume, which is out in book form, and then there's also a third and fourth volume which have not come out in book form yet. I think they're not coming out until June 2022, maybe even longer than that, I'm not sure. And there wasn't a lot of information about it online. I'd be interested to see this one in graphic novel form, just because the way that you kind of scroll down the page is a big part of the webcomic. I think there's a lot of scrolly things, or leaves and flowers, kind of petals falling down the page. So I wonder how that would look in book form. Overall, I enjoyed it. I plan to continue. There wasn't a lot of meat there, so there's not a lot to talk about. The next book that I finished in January is The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. This is a cozy mystery written in 2020. Richard Osman, I guess, is a presenter and comedian in Britain. This was a great cozy mystery. I really enjoyed it. This was the first book this year that made me cry. There was definitely some soft, poignant moments. The Thursday Murder Club takes place in a old folks retirement village where there is a Thursday murder club. A few members who live in the village meet every Thursday to go over cold cases. All of these villagers have relevant pasts. One is an ex-MI5 agent, one was an ex-cop, one was an activist, one was a psychiatrist, and so they all bring unique skills. When the ex-cop can no longer participate, they bring on a new member who used to be a nurse, and she has skills to lend to the Thursday Murder Club as well. They're happy to try and solve cold cases, but when a real live murder happens right at their doorstep, they are super thrilled to start investigating a current murder. It was really cozy, it was really fun, it was funny, it made me laugh out loud a couple times, it was poignant, it was a little bit sad. I'm surprised at this book, and I'm surprised that I liked it as much as I did, and that it kind of made me feel as much as I did, because it's so hyped. It's one of the best best-selling books in England ever, I think. People just really like it, and I'm just surprised that I also really enjoyed it. I think it had a lot of commentary on how we discount older folks as not being able to keep up with current ideas and ideals, and how we consider kind of past generations to be not only stuck in their ways, but kind of not worth our time a lot of the time, and that they don't have anything necessarily irrelevant to add to a conversation. You can talk about the past with them, but you can't talk about current day. The idea behind this kind of was that even though these characters are older, are octogenarians, they still have the thoughts and feelings, and they still have the passions that they had when they were young. So those things don't really go away. Now, I don't think that's actually true. I think that a lot of times older people do lose their passions. They do disconnect with their younger selves, and they do get stuck in societal norms and what society wants them to do and what they want them to be. I think that a lot of times older people mellow, so the passions that they had when they were young, whether that was for activism or teaching or whatever it is, kind of diminish as they get older, either through complacency, laziness, or again, because society says that old people are not supposed to be passionate about things. I think it was an interesting idea, and I'm definitely looking forward to the things that are spoken about in future books. There's already a sequel to this one, so I definitely want to pick that up, because I do think it had also some interesting conversations about regret and what people wish they had done, what people wish they had said to other people, how they wish they had treated their family. Those are just interesting questions to pose. Like, what are you going to think about when you're older? What are you going to wish you had done, or wish you had said, or wish you could have told someone when you are an old person living in a retirement village? It also has a little bit of commentary on like rich people versus poor people and working class versus upper class. And also obviously you have to suspend your disbelief a little bit because it is a silly, cozy mystery, and there are just some convenient things about this book and convenient things about solving these mysteries. I think that the mystery was pretty easy to solve. At least I had like 3 options, and one of the options was the truth. It wasn't like groundbreaking in that way, but I did really like to read about a different collection of people than we would normally read about. I liked that these were not young, brash, up-and-coming people. These were people who had lived entire lives, and they used their lives to help solve this crime and help each other and help their community and help people around them. Those were 2 more books that I finished in January, and I will catch up with you when I read some more. It is January 14th, and yesterday I finished my 4th book in January. It is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. That's better. This book was left here actually in my guest room by my best friend Isaac. He had lived with us for a short time, and he had moved out, and then he left this book here, and then he asked if he left it here, and I didn't see it. It had fallen behind something, so I said no, and then he read his girlfriend's copy, and then I found this book and I decided to read it this year. This is such an interesting book because it's obviously very well loved and well renowned, but it's a little bit difficult to explain. I think that every video I ever saw or explanation I ever saw of this book didn't really prepare me for what it was about exactly. It's sort of a epistolary novel, it's sort of a autofiction novel, it's sort of a novel in verse. It has elements of all those things. Ostensibly, it is a letter to the author's mother and the main character's mother. Our main character, Little Dog, is a Vietnamese immigrant, and his mother and grandmother and he live in a very downtrodden town of Hartford, Connecticut. They are faced with racism and language barriers and various other things, which Little Dog tries to bridge by becoming more American. So he is writing this letter to his mother, explaining his life, his thoughts on growing up, his feelings about his mother, his feelings about his grandmother, his coming out, his falling in love, and all these things, but he's writing to her in English. So she's never going to be able to read this letter that he's written her, and it's unclear whether he's writing this for her or for himself. It's a very moving and poetic book. Like I said, it's not necessarily written in verse, but it's not written in straight prose either. It definitely has the feeling of poetic prose or verse when you're reading it, and it's not a linear story. The story goes from him writing this letter once he's graduated college and is living outside of Hartford, Connecticut. It tells of his childhood, it tells of his young adulthood, of his realizing that he's gay, of his falling in love. It goes back and forth in time. It also tells a little bit of the story of his grandmother's life and his mother's life. And you don't know how much of this is made up for this fictional tale or how much of it is autobiography or autofiction. It is quite short. I had heard a lot about it and I didn't realize it was so short, so I was happy to have picked it up. It's difficult to read in many respects. It's very tangible and visceral, which can be heartwarming, but also tends to be quite violent, both in actual violence, but also just in the jarring nature of describing bodily functions and feelings and emotions, but also tangible, actual feelings, the heat, the cold, the water, the dryness. It's a very interesting book in that you definitely feel each element. So emotional element, but also physical element of what he's talking about in a very visceral, tangible way. The things that I had heard about this book, I didn't think I was going to enjoy it. It's a very different reading experience than I'm used to, and I like weird books and I like things that are out of the norm, but this reading experience is quite different than almost any other book I've ever read. I really liked that aspect of it because it really sucked you in with the writing and the writing style being so different, but there was genuine emotional connection to the characters and to the situations that kind of kept you with the story as well, even through the extremely difficult parts of this story. I really loved this one. I wish that this had been my first read of 2022. I wish I could say, oh, the first book that I finished in 2022 was this book by an Asian American, a Vietnamese American author. I can't say that, unfortunately, but I've already read quite a few good books and I'm happy to continue in my January reading. It is January 19th, and since the last time I talked to you, I finished 4 books in January. I think I'm speeding through books in January partly because I'm reading mostly novellas for Kristinell's January Novella Challenge. The next book that I finished in January was The Story of My Teeth by Valeria Luiselli. This is a very strange little novella. It's 195 pages, and a lot of those pages are end pages, or there's some graphics, there's some photographs, and there's some timeline involved in that as well. This is the story of Gustavo Sanchez, and he is telling us his history and the history of his teeth as he is an older man. He talks a little bit about his youth and how he worked at a museum and how he really enjoyed that, and then later how he became a world-renowned auctioneer. And one of the impetuses for his life and one of the reasons that he switched careers, went on many adventures, traveled, and all of those things was to acquire a better set of teeth. He read a story about a man who had acquired a better set of teeth and wrote a novel and became famous, and that was one of the things that he wanted to do as well. He buys a pair of teeth at an auction, and supposedly these teeth are Marilyn Monroe's teeth, and he has them implanted in his face, and after that moment his life kind of turns around. One of the reasons that he becomes a famous auctioneer is that he is a collector of things. He's collected things since he was a child, and anything he finds he collects and stores in a giant warehouse near his home. It's a very meandering kind of tale, and it follows Sanchez's different theories of auctioning, how he uses auctioning to kind of inflate himself and inflate his items that he's auctioning and to bring importance to the seemingly mundane. So you never know if he's telling the truth, you never know if he is lying, you never know if he believes in his mind that it's true, but the actions and interactions in this book are false. It's a really interesting story. I picked it up because I saw a booktuber talking about it, and it just seems so amazing that I went out and I purchased it right away. I got it from a used bookstore online, but it took me a little while to read it. I know that I was originally attracted to the story because of the idea of collecting things. I'm a collector of the mundane myself, and also because it had to do with teeth. As you may have noticed, I have some pretty weird teeth myself, so that is something that really interests me. The idea of people's relationships with their teeth and with other teeth and with other objects and things concerning teeth. I don't know if I really realized that before I heard the description of this book, but once I did, I knew that that was something that I wanted to seek out and I wanted to read more of in the future. Stories of teeth are going to be something that I definitely keep my eye out for. This is a translated work. It was translated by Christina McSweeney, and she does some of the timeline in the back as well, so I don't know how much she actually worked with Valeria on this book or whether it was just through translation. I think she's translated some of other of Valeria's works as well, so I would definitely be interested in checking out more of their collaborations and more of their work separately. I really enjoyed this book. It is a little bit heartbreaking and it is a little bit depressing, I guess is not quite the right word. It turns out to be quite a sad story, and it's hard to say whether it was always a sad story or the kind of eventual truths that you learn about our narrator make it sad. But I think overall it was really interesting, very evocative, and obviously also it was about the characters that are involved, but also about the places that are real life places that I assume Valeria visited or knows well. The locations were almost characters themselves, and so that gave you like an interesting grounding in reality, but it was a very unrealistic book in a lot of ways too. There's definitely fabulism in this book, but it's hard to say if there's magical realism. Nothing magical really happens, but the imagination and the drive and the fantastic nature of our main character kind of are magic. I thought that the writing style was very interesting, although at times hard to read. It is broken up into many different sections, and some of those sections are solely Sanchez doing his auctioneering. Sometimes the tone changes drastically. Sometimes there are interludes of recipes or stories or anecdotes, and then also we have the photos and timeline in the back. So the writing style changes a lot. Sometimes that made the story not flow quite the way that you would hope, and it was hard to be broken up into multiple different styles and ideas because sometimes that took you out of the story itself. That being said, it's divided into these little sections, so you really can read a section as its own tiny piece of the book, stop, and then start reading a new section, and it's not quite as jarring that way. Overall, I really enjoyed this book, and I look forward to reading more from both the author and the translator. The next book that I finished in January was Murder on the SS Rosa, a Ginger Gold mystery by Lee Strauss. This is a little independently published book that I found in a little free library in Ocean Grove, New Jersey. I picked it up because it definitely looks like a Golden Age mystery, obviously written more currently, and it has a Boston Terrier on the cover, so I figured a Boston Terrier probably played a role in this book. That sounded pretty fun to me. This follows Ginger Gold as she travels across the Atlantic to England. Her father has recently passed away, and him being from English descent, he has some property in London that she needs to go and attend to. She is a super fashionable and charismatic young woman who may or may not have been a spy in France during World War I. This takes place after World War I but before World War II, and she is traveling with her companion Haley, who was a nurse in the war, and is going to England to enroll in a university to become a female doctor, something that is quite new at the time this book takes place. Ginger and Haley are unlikely friends, but they love each other very much, and they couldn't be more different. Ginger is energetic and outgoing. She loves fashion and high style. Haley is much more practical, much more introverted, and much more serious. Both having backgrounds in the war, they're not at all surprised when a murder takes place on the ship. Haley and Ginger are no strangers to death and destruction, and they waste no time in insinuating themselves in the case. This is a very fine, fun, silly, cozy mystery. It's obviously written by someone who takes themselves a little too seriously as an author and who definitely still needs practice as an author. This is the first book in the series. It's like 0.5 in the series though, so I don't know if this is like a prequel or if this is really what to expect, but I think it was the first written in the series. And there's like, I'm not even kidding, like 15 books already. Like there's so many books already from 2017. So this person is obviously someone who's been thinking about this story, been writing it in little short bursts, and good for them. I mean, wonderful that you can be a self-published author, wonderful that you can have an idea for a book and then create that book. That's great. Although it wasn't terribly well written, it was a perfectly fine, cozy mystery. It was short, which I enjoyed. It got to the point pretty quickly, which I enjoyed. There weren't a lot of clues or red herrings. There wasn't a lot of depth to the mystery aspects. There was a lot of attention paid to what Ginger's wearing and what other people are wearing and the fashions, but there were some standout moments, I think, in this book. I would not be picking up this author's work unless I happen to just see it, find it. I would not seek out the sequels to this book, but if I ever came across another Ginger Gold mystery, I would pick it up and read it. It took me maybe 24 hours, if that, to read. I don't think that this book particularly made me feel anything, except, again, maybe a little envy in going out and finding your dream and making your dreams come true of being an author, of self-publishing, of selling your books online, of being able for someone like me to find your book in a little free library. So maybe I'm a little envious of Lee Strauss, and I wish her, of course, all the best. As far, again, as writing structure and writing, this is very straightforward, very simple, cozy mystery. You're introduced to the characters, you're introduced to the potential suspects, a murder occurs, and then a murder is solved. Of course, it's solved just in the nick of time. I don't think there's anything groundbreaking about that, but again, if you're self-publishing your novels and you're working towards becoming a better writer while publishing books, I think that's a great start, and I couldn't begrudge anyone their self-published work. That was the 6th book that I've read in January. The 7th book that I've read in January was The Chrysalids by John Wyndham. This was a modern classic sci-fi novel that I had never heard of before last year. Last year in 2021 was the first year that I heard of John Wyndham. He was a fairly renowned but mostly forgotten modern classic sci-fi writer. Now, modern classic sci-fi is basically classic sci-fi, and some of his books, like The Day of the Triffids, are considered classic sci-fi novels. Day of the Triffids is on my 21 books I found out about in 2021 that I want to read in 2022 list. I couldn't find that book on audio, but I did find The Chrysalids, which is a later novel than that novel, but is often more renowned for being a better sci-fi novel. The Chrysalids follows David, who lives in a very strict and puritanical family who owns a big farm in a fairly well-off village on Earth, we think, but it's a time after a time of great hardship when many deviations and mutations have started occurring in food, in livestock, in crops, and in people. This puritanical society, especially David's father, who is a strict preacher of normalcy and of regularity, finds these mutations and deviations abhorrent, and whenever they find one, they burn it, kill it, or sterilize it. That goes for crops, livestock, and people as well. Any infants who have abnormalities are found, they're killed immediately. Any people who are found out are banished to the Badlands. Our main character, David, has an abnormality, but it's one that you can't see. He is able to read minds and share word thoughts with other people like him. This form of telepathy is unheard of and unknown in these parts, so when he and his cousin figure out that they both have it, as well as some other people in the area, they know to keep it a big secret. As the Badlands and deviations encroach more and more, David and his cousin are now threatened. This was such a good classic sci-fi novel. It is tense. There is a feeling of like malice and foreboding the entire storyline. You realize along with David and his cousin who he eventually falls in love with that their abnormality must be kept secret at all times, and of course when that is threatened they have to go into a fight or flight mode. There are many incidents leading up to that kind of main event in the story that have all this foreboding. The sense of malice of the community is ever present for David and for the characters that are very quickly established and are very quickly loved by the reader. It's really easy to identify and enjoy David as a character as well as the other characters. There's some slight mystery aspects, there is some family connections, there's grief, there's horror, and it's just such a great sci-fi book. Super short, like 200 pages. I read this book on audio and I got it from a free audio site, and the reader was amazing. I really enjoyed whoever was reading it. I'm not sure who it was, because it was read in like a very measured way, and a way that both conveyed the subtle strictness and structure of this puritanical society, but also the connections, emotional involvement, and love of the characters. I really like this book. I think this book was written in the 40s or the 50s, and I can see that this book was highly influential to other sci-fi writers. It has sci-fi tropes that, although I don't think this is the first book that these tropes appeared in, I do think that this was probably a more well fleshed out and well-rounded version of those tropes than we had seen in earlier works. It was very tense, but it didn't have that sense of anticipation that I really don't like. Although you wanted to know what happened, and although there were things that you weren't sure how they were going to turn out, that blackmailing of emotion of anticipation wasn't there, but the intense and tense nature of the story was there. So to me, that was like a perfect combination. It wasn't the things that I don't like, and it was the things that I do like. I would definitely highly recommend this one. It is shocking and it is heartbreaking, and there is a lot of violence and death. There is some animal violence in this, as well as forced sterilization, talk about potential rape, and a lot of other like trigger warnings things. As far as like a short, sharp sci-fi novel, this is probably one of the better ones that I've read recently. The 8th book that I finished in January was Lore Olympus Volume 2. This is a webcomic turned graphic novel by Rachel Smythe, and I read the first one earlier this month. I'm reading them all on Webtoons, which is the free website where they can be found. I spoke about Lore Olympus already, but it is a love story and a retelling of the Persephone and Hades myth. Persephone is a spring goddess, and Hades is the god of the underworld. They come together in unexpected ways, and they both have feelings for each other. In this second volume, they're a little bit more involved, and some more curveballs are thrown their way. It's done in like a Wacom tablet, watercolory, manga style, drawing style, and I really like that. So you can have a very beautiful, graphic, painterly panel next to a panel of someone being embarrassed with their eyes wide and, you know, a drip of sweat on their face. So there's a nice juxtaposition there between a modern and manga-esque comics and beautiful painterly watercolor style work. I think that the story is quite slow and drawn out, and I do feel that that probably has to do with the author and illustrator writing them panel by panel and perhaps not having a set goal in mind or a fully fleshed out outline of a story. I feel like the first volume to this volume has gotten better in that way, in that it feels more planned out and it feels more intentional, but it's still quite meandering, and there's a lot of filler and there's a lot of filler graphics. I don't mind that. I do think that the love story is very cute. There's also some adult and important themes like sexual assault and abuse and coercion, an acknowledgement of age discrepancy and age gap. While I don't think it covers as many important topics as something like Heartstopper did, I do think there's some thought put into it in that respect, which I have enjoyed. The characters are cute and the graphics are pretty, and I really like the design and the way the pages scroll for long periods of time, whereas I think reading this in graphic novel form, I might not like it quite as much. I definitely plan to finish this series. I think there are at least 2 more volumes of this series on Webtoons, and I think those 2 are slated to come out in 2022 as graphic novels. Currently they're not on Goodreads and can't be used towards your Goodreads goal. What I think I want to do is pause that series for a little while because it does take up reading time that I could be reading something else, and then come back to it when it's hopefully closer to being put onto Goodreads as something that you can mark as read. I know that's like kind of goal book oriented, and especially for me, but it just feels like what I want to do. So those are the 4 next books that I read in January. I still have 12 days of the month left, so we'll see how much I can get through, and I'll catch up with you when I read some more. It is January 26th, and I finished 2 more books in January. I finished The Dream Quest of Vellitt, Beau by K.I.J. Johnson. This was a Tor Press book that I found in a little free library. I have never read a Tor book, but I know a lot of people swear by that publisher and anything they put out they like. Obviously it's an indie press, and I know they put out a lot of interesting sci-fi, I think, and fantasy books, among other things. Their logo is a spaceship, so I assume that they're known for some sci-fi and fantasy. It follows Vellitt Beau, who is a professor in an alternate dream world where women are not treated as equals, and where there still is kind of a poverty-stricken Middle Ages, old time kind of feel. She is a college professor at one of the very few women's college, and you get the sense right away that the women's college is not really appreciated by the culture or by the other colleges, and they're kind of thought of as a lesser college and a lesser endeavor for women to go to school. One of her students goes missing, and Velit ends up going after her. When she goes after her to bring her back to the school, you find out that our main character was a long traveler. She hiked all over the world. She saw all sorts of sights. This is a magical dream realm where there's soaring pinnacles of ice and gemstones, there's tessellated moving sky images, there's a fondness for cats, which is awesome. I do like that. As you follow her journey, you learn more that there is also a waking world. So the waking world is the real world. Even the people in this world, the dreamscape, kind of know that the people who come from the waking world can wake up at any time. They can travel here and they can travel back kind of at their will, but there are certain points where they can travel from, more easily at least. Velit goes on this quest, and you as the reader find out where this path leads her. This book credits a book by Lovecraft as being its inspiration, and maybe if I had read that book, or if I knew anything about that book, I would have been a little bit more impressed by this book. This book felt very amateurish to me. It felt very incomplete. It's very, very descriptive in its landscape, in different areas that she travels to and what they all look like and how people treat her. But it all felt like someone was explaining it to you, but they weren't very good at explaining things. Or that they had pictures in their head and didn't understand how to translate them so that you could understand what the pictures look like. Which is an interesting idea, actually, because of reading the Chrysalids earlier this month, where people are actually telepathic and they project pictures into your head. This was definitely not like that. The story is very, out of, like, not out of time, but like you can't tell how long anything is. You can't tell how long her travels are. There's a lot of things that don't really connect or make sense or keep you from being confused. It's not that I was confused through most of this book. I love to talk about my dreams, and I have really vivid dreams, and I like to write them down in a way that I think would be interesting to other people. This felt like somebody was telling me their dream and it didn't make any sense and it was really boring and they weren't a very good storyteller. Again, I'm not sure if maybe that was kind of the point because the author was emulating Lovecraft. I've never read any Lovecraft, so I can't speak to what that author's work is like and how it compares to this book. It just felt very amateurish. It felt like a young book, a young writer. There were some very interesting threads to pull. There was some interesting sci-fi ideas in this book, but I don't think that any of them were very well thought out, planned out, or explained. It kind of felt like you were in a video game. Like, think about video games today, right? Like, they're so amazing, they're so immersive. And then imagine going back to like the 90s and playing an open world game, but in the style of Nintendo. It's so pixelated and side-scrolly that you are not immersed at all. You can kind of see what they were going for, but the actual immersive elements aren't there. I also think that there was a lot of potentially questionable things. I think that our main character is described basically as a white woman, but then she like gets dreadlocks. There was kind of this whole, it felt like very sophomoric, early college experience of seeing other cultures and appropriating them. I don't know, it's a tough one to describe. I'm not unhappy that I read it, and I didn't hate it. I liked the ending, but it just felt very much a half-baked book. It felt very much an not unfinished, but unpolished work. The next book that I read in January, I finished this morning, and that was The Women of Brewster Place by Gloria Naylor. This was one that I first heard about from Greg at Supposedly Fun, and the reason that he talked about it was that it does have some queer elements and he had put it on his queer pile of possibilities. I found this one in a little free library in Tinton Falls. It's one of my favorites. The Women of Brewster Place follows Brewster Place, really. It says it's a novel in 7 short stories. They're kind of just told in different like story chapters or character chapters. Short stories aren't necessarily whole and complete on their own, so I don't think that it really is short stories. I think it's just character chapters. It follows different women as they come back to or leave Brewster Place, which is what seems like a low-income housing development in a big city. We follow a collection of Black women from all different backgrounds and experiences, of all different shades and sizes, with all different problems and solutions. It's about female friendship, female love, and how women deal with a lot of the injustices that are forced upon them by the world. It's a little bit about community, communal pain and grief. Also how a tight-knit community, a small community like a housing development can turn against itself and against its members. The first part of this book really reminded me a lot of Sula. A little bit in the writing style, a little bit in the setting, a little bit in the circumstances, and I really liked the first like 3/4 of the book a lot. I liked hearing about these women, and I liked how their lives and their individual stories were woven together by all coming to Brewster's Place and living in the same development. Maddie, who is the first woman that we read about, is kind of in every other story. I love that idea. So every chapter, even though they're not directly about her, she does kind of make an appearance and she does have something to do with it. Obviously, a book written about the 30s through the 80s involving Black women is going to be a tough read in many respects. A lot of bad things are going to happen to these women. There's going to be a lot of abuse at the hands of men. There's going to be a lot of injustices. There's going to be a lot of racism and the system failing these women, and that is definitely true. I do think that there's a thread of love and connection with other women, especially in this book, and how women lean on each other and take care of each other to strengthen each other to be able to get through some of those hard things in life. And then at the last third of the book, last quarter of the book, we have a chapter about two women who move to Brewster Place, and they're very quiet and they stick to themselves. And of course, everybody starts saying, well, they're lesbians. And they are lesbians. You get to see some of their problems and where they came from and their background. And then the book kind of takes a turn. And then there's this horrible tragedy. It didn't ruin the book for me. It's heartbreaking to read about racism, hard to read about abuse towards women. I think that that storyline and the downward direction that it went into really just made this book too much for me. I would definitely recommend this one. I am glad that I read it. I think the first half of this book was a very enjoyable reading experience, and the last quarter of this book was a very unenjoyable reading experience. So you would kind of have to make up your own mind about how you felt and look at all the trigger warnings and make sure that you were able to handle this story. But I think it is probably an American Black classic, especially by a female author, and definitely worth checking out. So I think that was the 10th book that I read in January. I'm definitely on a roll. This was a novella as well, so I'm going to keep ticking off those novellas. It is January 30th, and last week, Thursday or Friday, we finished reading The Hobbit by JRR Tolkien. My husband and I were reading this on audio. We were listening to it, and we actually found a YouTuber who read this, who was really good. His handle was Now Hear This, and I will link his channel down below. He also reads some of my favorite books. I haven't listened to anything else that he's read yet. This is a reread for me. The Hobbit is about a hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, who is quite satisfied with his life and doesn't expect any adventure or adversity. He just wants to live in his cozy, happy hobbit hole, but when Gandalf the Wizard comes and makes him an offer, he feels unable to refuse. This offer is the offer of an adventure with dwarves and goblins and elves and wargs and wizards and so many other things. During his adventure to help the dwarves reclaim their homelands, he finds a very special ring that gives him special powers. This is sometimes called Lord of the Rings Zero, the very famous epic fantasy series that most of you will have already heard of and many of you will already have read. I really, really enjoy The Hobbit. I like The Hobbit more than The Lord of the Rings, if I remember correctly, but I haven't read The Lord of the Rings since the original movies came out, so it's been 20 years or whatever it's been. I think I've read The Hobbit twice before this reading, so I think once before those movies came out, and then once since then, and now. I like this book because it's an adventure story, it's heartwarming, has a lot of morals, good-heartedness, and the people who come out on top are the people who, despite their flaws, try to do the best that they can, and I like that kind of story, and I like that kind of book. This one is often looked down upon by real heavy Lord of the Rings fans because they see it as a childish version or a kid's book. It is written in a very whimsical style where there is a narrator. He's telling you the story of Bilbo Baggins and he's kind of interjecting his own ideas. It's not 100% clear if this is Bilbo Baggins writing his story later and talking to you, because Bilbo does write his life story, or if this is just kind of an omnipotent narrator for the book. I like the whimsy in this story. I like the idea of it being very basic, again, in its idea of good and evil, of taking care of people or not taking care of people, because there are a lot of nuances to the story and there are a lot of potential for people to do wrong or go wrong, and there are bad characters in the story. So I appreciate that it's told in a whimsical way. I also think that this is an incredibly epic fantasy world, which I have never delved 100% into, but I appreciate that the Hobbit lets you get there in an accessible way, as opposed to, I think, the Lord of the Rings books or something like the Silmarillion, which is like extra stories of the Lord of the Ring universe, which is very dense and there's a million characters and there's so much going on. I think this is a little bit more streamlined, a little bit easier to get into the world. This book is sweet and heartwarming, whimsical and fun, and it does make you feel all those things. There's some shocking moments where things happen that you don't expect. There's some awe, and I was definitely captivated, and by the end I was like, how is it all going to wrap up? How is Bilbo going to get home? Is he going to get home? What's going to happen? Even though I'd read the story and I know what eventually happens, there is that sense of like, wow, the book's almost over. Like, what's going to happen? How is this all going to wrap up? Which I feel like I've noticed that I feel a lot about books, and I don't know if that's a me thing or a book thing. I was super happy to reread this. It's fun to read it with my husband. We tend to read like mysteries or sci-fi, so it was fun to get into a fantasy, and especially one that he is really fond of and that he has read multiple times before as well. That was the 11th book that I read in January. It is February, but I finished one more book in January, The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This book was on my 20 books I found out about in 2020 that I want to read in 2021, but unfortunately I didn't get to it in 2021. I got to it in January of 2022. This book is about a not too distant future after war and climate issues have created a world where some people live in tall, rich, high cities, and some people live in the wasteland, which is essentially an acrid, arid, toxic desert. You can imagine which people live in the cities and which people live in the desert. Something that the scientists in these high cities have discovered is how to travel between multiverse worlds. They use this knowledge to import different elements and objects and things that they need for mining, but they also mine these new worlds for intelligence. The only way to traverse between worlds is to be deceased on the other worlds. So you can only move to a world without harm that you are already dead on. And our main character, Kara, is dead on almost all the worlds. She's only alive on about 8 out of 380 some worlds, and she is the most used traverser. She thinks of this as a job, and she is happy to have moved out of the wastelands and into the city. She has a huge crush on her handler, and she is in awe and inspired by the creator of this technology, who she looks to as a mentor. Of course, Kara has secrets of her own, and there is more to traversing than meets the eye. So this book is like a post-apocalyptic sci-fi multiverse kind of story. The main character, Kara, has to struggle with being a fish out of water, being someone out of place, finding her place in this new rich environment. She struggles with having a crush on her handler being really cold, and she sees that as a form of classism. She knows that she is the lesser in this community and the lesser in this world, so she has to deal with her own feelings of place, importance. She also comes from a very violent background, so she is trying to distance herself from her past and what people in this world think of her past and think of people who come from where she comes from, but also she's trying to overcome the trauma that she's faced, and she is mostly a lot of times in survival mode. You find out things about her that change the circumstances. This book is like 350 pages, and I started reading it intending that I would finish it in February, but I kind of flew through it. It was very easy to read. It's a debut novel. I know that this has been criticized for being slow, but I thought it was very well paced. I thought the time that you got information about the character and about the world was well placed so that you didn't have all the answers, but you didn't feel lost in the story. And then there were some things that were in the beginning of the story that came back around, or there was elements that ran throughout the story, which came kind of in the end to conclusion. A lot of this story is about grief, about grieving for your former self, your former life, about grief that you feel for getting out of traumatic situations or abusive relationships, about the grief that you feel when other people don't get out of those situations. It also is a lot about survival and what you're going to do to survive, if you're going to make the right choices. So it's been a little over a week since I last spoke to you. My camera died and then life happened and I wasn't able to continue my review of The Space Between Worlds. I think I mostly told you what this book was about, and the last thing to tell you is that I really, really enjoyed it. I thought that this was just a fun and interesting dystopian take on a future. I thought it had a lot of commentary on rich versus poor, of discrepancy of wealth due to race and stature. I just really, really liked it. I would definitely read anything else that Micaiah Johnson comes out with. I know she's working on another book in this universe, which is cool, and I will of course read it because I really did enjoy this one, but I would love to see something else by her, maybe something a little more contemporary and a little less fantasy / sci-fi, just because I think she dealt with or touched upon a lot of really interesting topics in this book, and I would love to see more of that kind of set in a more realistic world. This was the 12th book that I read in January, and before we move on to my wrap-up of the wrap-up, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about The Woman of Brewster Place, because I found this an extremely exhausting read, and in some ways a frustrating read. This book has stuck with me more than a month after reading it, not necessarily in the best ways. Although I think this is a very well-written book and a powerful book, this book gave me so many nightmares, and I've thought about it every day since I've read it, but I've also been scared of it every day since I've read it, which I think is worth noting. It's not often that a book will affect me so harshly. There was an extremely graphic on-page rape scene in this. There was a very gruesome murder in this, and I think my earlier review of it didn't really give justice, that there are a lot of extreme trigger warnings to this book, and I think before you pick it up, especially as a woman, you should read those trigger warnings and see if this is something that you are able to handle at the time. Like I said, I have had many, many nights of nightmares from this book. Even a extremely paranoid and upset feeling that has followed me if I think about this book too much. Is that the sign of a good book? Maybe it is, because it has stuck with me. I think one of the reasons that it has affected me so deeply is because, without giving too much away, the resolutions of this book are nebulous. The bad people in this book continue to be bad, and the good people in this book continue to be abused and have to fight for just ability to be. Since there was no clear moral repercussions for some of the things that happen, since there's no justice for the consequences of some of the actions in this book, it feels very raw, it feels very open, it feels very continuing. There was nothing in this book that said like, oh, the bad guys got what they deserved and the good people got what they deserved. And again, maybe that's a great book, maybe that's something that is important. Personally and emotionally and psychologically, this book might have damaged me. So I just wanted to put that out there. I'm not saying that you shouldn't read it, and I'm not saying that I didn't enjoy it and I didn't get a lot from it, but what I got from it was a much harder, harsher, and unpleasant thing than I was hoping for. Those were all the books that I read in January, and I had such an amazing reading month. This month felt so long, which was great. Like, I would love it if every month felt as long as January, because I was able to read so many great things and I was able to really accomplish a lot of the things that I wanted to accomplish. I think I did a really good job at reading diversely. I read quite a few books from BIPOC authors. I read some translated work. I read some indie press. I was able to do a really fun reread. I was able to finish a DNF. Everything was interesting and compelling, and I had such a great time. I read a lot of unexpected books that not only did I not think I was going to read at this time, but I didn't think I was really going to enjoy. I got some cozy mysteries in, which of course is my favorite genre. I read some sci-fi, some fantasy. I'm super happy with where I am on the diversity scale. I'm super happy with where I am on the amount of book scale. I'm super happy that I read a lot of books that I was looking forward to. Overall, totally amazing reading month. Very happy to have had the time and space to read all these amazing books in January. This is going to be an extremely long wrap up because I read 12 books and because all the books could be talked about so much more in depth. Have you read any of the books that I read here? Let me know in the comments below if you have, and if you have any thoughts on them. I would love to have deeper discussions of almost every single book that I read in January, so please feel free to leave any comments you have below. Let me know what your favorite book that you read in January was, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye!